Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. We're here to mark the launch of the BASWA England Domestic Abuse Guidance. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to take the time to acknowledge what's happened over the last couple of weeks and what continues to happen to women and girls everywhere. The recent news of Sarah Everard's death has really hit home for many women, and we've been united in collective grief with sisters around the world. I'd also like to take the time to acknowledge Blessings Olugesin, Shukri Abdi, Biba Henry, Nicole Smallman, and all the other women of colour who often don't get the media recognition that they deserve. In light of this, I'm going to pass over to a singer-songwriter, Leah Bartoli, who's written a really moving song about violence against women.
I feel so strongly about what's going on in the world right now regarding Sarah Everard, and I feel so many things about it, and the only way that I'm going to make those feelings make sense is for me to write about it and make music about it. So I wrote this song last night, and I have the urge to share it, so if you could just like it and share with everyone and spread awareness, I'd really appreciate it. This is for all my women who are too scared to go out. This is for all my women who are too scared to leave the house. Men, why don't you fix that for us? Men, why don't you help the change? Why does it always stay the same? Always the women to take the blame. Huh. Say it's cause of what we're wearing, saying that we flirt too much, so we try to put you up by swearing. We've even tried to cover up, but you won't take no hints, so we try to put it bluntly. Don't touch me, I'm so sick of it. Your forwardness is so ugly, boys. Your silence is deafening. Don't you know that it speaks volumes? Oh, it feels so threatening. Can't you see it's part of the problem? Even with a long way home, just to get us out of bother, make sure we have someone on the phone and share locations with each other. I think that you should pattern your mister, and you should call out your friends. She's a person, not just a girl from mother, sister. I see the behavior that you defend, and this is a scary world, and I hate never being safe, but this is the life of a girl. Why are women's rights up for debate? Say it's cause of what we're wearing, saying that we flirt too much, so we try to put you up by swearing. We've even tried to cover up, but you won't take no hints, so we try to put it bluntly. Don't touch me, I'm so sick of it. Your forwardness is so ugly. This is for all my women who wanna make a difference. Men, you better listen. This is for all my women who wanna make a difference, yeah. Men, you better listen, yeah, oh yeah.
Many thanks to Leah Bartoli for speaking such truth to power with those words. I'd just like to take the time to briefly go over what the guide is and what our aims are. So we know that domestic abuse is endemic and it devastates the lives of survivors from every intersection of society. It doesn't discriminate. That includes women of different backgrounds, ethnicities, cultures, classes, sexualities. It includes care experienced women, women who have been deprived from education, and I just want to take the time to really acknowledge that. So as we go through the rest of this webinar, if you could really watch it with that intersectional lens, that would be fantastic. Within the guide, we have made references and we have sections covering supporting Black and minoritised women, how to support survivors from backgrounds such as deafness and disabilities. And so within the guide, you will be able to access that. We've sought key messages from specialist run services, social workers and people with lived experience which cover these intersectionalities, and we're very fortunate that some of these women will be sharing their stories directly with us today. We're so very grateful for the survivors who have shared their stories both within the guidance and today as well. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So the purpose of the webinar is to raise awareness of how domestic abuse impacts survivors differently according to these intersectional factors, to share safe models for practice, and to reflect on recent research of patterns of abuse, especially during COVID-19. At the end, there will be a time for question and answers. So if you do want to make a question, just feel free to do so by typing in the chat box to the right of the screen. We're also encouraging anyone who's on Twitter to use that during the session. So we're going to be using the hashtags #EndDomesticAbuseBaswa and social workers against domestic abuse, both of which will pop in the chat for you. So without further ado, let's begin with quick introductions. Could we start with yourself, Asmat?
Hello everybody, my name is Asmat Khan and I'll be doing a short presentation for you this afternoon. I'm currently a social work student at Buckinghamshire University.
Thank you so much. And we'll move on to Pragna. Oh, sorry, I think you might just be on mute there.
Yeah. Hello everyone, I'm Pragna Patel and I'm the director at Southall Black Sisters, and I'll be doing a very short presentation on some of the issues impacting on BME women.
Thank you so much. If we could move on to Sarah Goff.
Hi, thanks Becca. Morning everyone, and thanks to BASWA for organising this. I'm from the Anne Craft Trust, social work background, and my current work is looking at the experiences of deaf and disabled young people and the impact of domestic abuse on them and their need for services. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. And finally, moving on to Sarah McMillan.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah McMillan. I'm a professional officer with BASWA but based in Scotland, which we call SASWA. And I'm going to talk to you about a model for working with domestic abuse where children are involved, which we're offering UK-wide at the moment.
Thank you, Sarah. And finally, my name's Rebecca Pierre, and I'm a professional officer at BASWA as well. We were going to be joined by Dr. Michaela Rogers from the University of Sheffield, but unfortunately she can't make it today. However, we will signpost all resources. We'll be sending up a follow-up email with the guide and also all of the truly incredible material that's out there from Southall Black Sisters, Women's Aid, Gallup, Anne Craft Trust, and all of our partners as well. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier what the purpose of the webinar is. It's to raise awareness of all the different intersectionalities. So we know, for example, that all women experience domestic abuse, but if you are a white woman, for example, you might experience that abuse very differently from a black woman with a disability, for example. So really focusing on those different experiences and how they overlap, and multiple and double jeopardies as well. We're looking at safe models for practice and a Q&A session. So if we could go on to our Women's Aid video now. We're so fortunate to have the voices of people with lived experience today. We're going to show two videos from Women's Aid. One of them is a video of a survivor and the other is a top tips video.
Listen to survivors. We are the experts in our own lives.
Do not assume that a child survivor is less knowledgeable than an adult survivor.
Approach us on a human level and as a whole person.
Ensure you have a real understanding of the dynamics of domestic abuse, especially coercive control, and how perpetrators can manipulate the system and professionals.
Be transparent and clear.
Make us retell our story unnecessarily. Read the notes, but don't prejudge.
Work with us, not against or for us. Take a collaborative and empowering approach.
Don't jeopardise our safety. For example, ensure you know the safe methods to communicate for the survivors you are working with.
Respect our different cultures, identities, and life experiences. Do not make judgments based on prejudice, stereotypes, or assumptions.
Make sure perpetrators are part of the picture and try to work with them. The perpetrator is responsible for the abuse, not the survivor.
Understand the impact of domestic abuse on our mental well-being and the different coping mechanisms survivors may have.
Focus on well-being, not just risk and physical safety. For example, help us build our self-esteem and support us to connect with others in our community.
I'd like to take a moment to thank the survivors who contributed to both videos. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone when I say just how eye-opening that all of your stories were, and we are so very grateful. I think what really stood out to myself listening to those messages was the way in which women are disproportionately blamed, and the onus for change and responsibility is so often put on the women, and that's something that we really try to hone in on in the guide about why it's so important to engage with perpetrators and not view women just through the lens of their responsibility. So again, huge thank you. We know that some of those videos may have been distressing to some viewers. If you do need some support after this video, or you'd just like to reach out and talk through any of what's been said, at BASWA England, we will be here for you, and we'll pop some of those opportunities in the chat about who you can go to if you do need some debrief support as well. So thank you ever so much. We're now going to move on to Asmat, who's going to speak about her lived experience.
Hello everybody. I'm going to start off with a little brief summary of my background. So my name's Asmat Khan. I'm of Pakistani origin. I was born in Rotherham, South Yorkshire. At the age of 19, I had a forced marriage to my first cousin, who lived in Luton with his mum, dad, older brother, and our grandmother. I literally just went into a room and was told someone wanted to marry me, and I had to say yes and not to embarrass my dad. I got pregnant 6 months into the marriage. As I was pressured by the family to have children, I took an overdose before my daughter turned 1. She was not accepted due to her sex. I experienced physical, mental abuse, locked in the bedroom, no access to the phone or going to the shops or to the doctors or contact with my family, beatings from my mother-in-law and husband whilst the others watched on. I lost over 4 stone in weight, became weak and had to stop breastfeeding as I was so weak. When my daughter turned 1, they dropped me at my mum's one day because my uncle was in a hospice diagnosed with cancer. I left with a small handheld suitcase and a pushchair, and they never came back to get me. A year later, I ran away from my mum with my daughter after an Asian Women's Advice Centre opened up on in the area in Rotherham. which was a godsend. I spent the night in Sheffield in a women's refuge, where they put me on the first train to London the next day to another refuge in Enfield, Middlesex. I was there for a week, and my address was given out to the Safe House in court, as my daughter's father at the time had decided to apply for contact, as I had requested all my belongings back. I was on my way back from a walk in the park, and the cab was waiting for me with all my belongings, and I was moved after that 7 times in a space of 6 months from refuge to refuge. I had no social worker, and the only support I had was that from the refuge staff and the women that lived in the refuge. So my first slide is how can social workers help women from BAME backgrounds? Next slide, please. So to gain better knowledge and understanding of cultural backgrounds, our backgrounds are so complex, and people need to understand how they work. Understanding the dynamics of male patriarchies within the households, as this is still very prevalent, and expectations on us as Asian women, not being allowed to work, child rearing, implications of infertility, housework, preference of sons over daughters, when we're having children, cooking and preparing meals, and the importance of how everything has to be perfect, and how we have to cook for everybody, and how we dress, and that also plays a big part, especially because I'm from a Muslim background, and I was told all the time not to wear certain clothes and to keep covered up. Next slide, please. So what can social workers do better? They need to gain a better understanding of how women feel. Women are not victims, and it is important to understand that narratives are not helpful of social workers as saviours and survivors as victims. Women may feel scared of letting family down, a lack of understanding of who to go to for help, especially where girls and women are not UK citizens, so they've come from areas such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and they're not aware of who to go to or where to go to for help. Communication barriers, so better ways of working and communication barriers are needed. It's so important, to understand that not everybody speaks English. We're a very diverse country, and English is not everybody's spoken language. A real learning of the cultural background of the family. So as one of the survivors said earlier, historical context is so important. You need to go back and read up on the notes, look what's been happening historically with that individual, and be proactive. Ask for additional training. If you don't understand, just ask, take ownership and be prepared to advocate on behalf of that individual or that family. It's okay to not understand a culture or a cultural practice. If you ask someone, there's got to be somebody who will explain or signpost you to the right person. Next slide, please. So what can organisations do better? Organisations, recruitment is at the top of the list, I think. So first of all, staff from more diverse backgrounds helps ensure a healthy mixture of knowledge and experience. So from within the team, which can resonate all the way through, we have to be really sort of focused on who we're recruiting, and what backgrounds these individuals are coming from and what they can bring to the team as a whole. Organisations need to address anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory and anti-racist practice much more stringently in order to meet the needs of those individuals. As a survivor, I had support from people who didn't know anything about my culture, who didn't know anything about me, and I would often have them sniggering at me because I was a Muslim, because I was living in a refuge. During my journey, I only ever stayed in one refuge that was only for Asian women, and it was probably one of the only refuges where I felt very comfortable, because they knew about me, they knew my culture, and they understood a lot better So moving on, this can be through organisations. So recruitment can be through organisations, organisational culture, amendment to policies and procedures. We need to look at those policies and procedures when anybody starts a new role. Policies and procedures are right there in the induction. We need to be making sure that things are embedded in these policies and procedures for people to go back and refer to when they need guidance, and to have carefully procured training packages in place for staff. So next slide, please. And my top 5 tips are: a better synthesized knowledge of the service user group that you're supporting, have a much more deeper understanding. You know, you've got to understand how we're feeling, what we've come from, what support we're going to need going forward. Experience and links to local agencies who support the service user group. So there's always agencies. I've worked in health and social care for over 20 years. There is, if you network and if you look around, there are other organisations out there that can help social workers to improve their practice and to work collaboratively with others. Number 3, BAME champions within the teams who have an awareness or completed extensive training or have lived experiences within the team. So BAME champions, they don't have to be colleagues who identify as such, and it's really important for all colleagues to get involved and raise awareness together regardless of race. And having those BAME champions, you know that in your team you have somebody to go to if you need that advice or support in regards to somebody you're working directly with. Number 4, tools to support BAME families which are culturally specific, such as in the same language with pictures, putting packages together that are more culturally specific. So if somebody's come from a certain part of the world, what are their cultures there? And trust, because trust is key to how we work. We have to be able to trust the individual that we're working with. And number 5 is local authorities need to develop policies and risk assessments for BAME families. Frameworks need to be more inclusive of cultural and religious diversity, because understanding different beliefs from different cultures is so important, because there's different beliefs within cultures and cultures have complexities within them. And I think that's really, really important. And having suffered the domestic abuse and having gone through a forced marriage, you know, it's looking at what happened 2 decades ago to what happens now. You know, we are moving on and things are getting better, but you know, we all need to work together collaboratively. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of the amazing insight and wisdom you've shared with us there, Asma. I think what really stood out to me was all of those really complex intersectional factors. There were layers upon layers. There was, you know, culture, race, religion, immigration status, language, and it's so important we look at each individual in a holistic way. You also mentioned about the dynamics of the male patriarchy, which are so important to address, and social workers not having a saviour complex. And would just very much echo what you've said about how important it is to connect with local specialist services who are really the experts. So thank you ever so much. We're going to move on to Sarah Goff now, who is going to talk about the specific and unique needs of survivors with disabilities. So over to yourself, Sarah. Oh, Sarah, I think you might just be on mute.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Next slide, please. I'm talking here today from the Ancraft Trust. Ancraft was one of the first people that started work with colleagues looking at sexual abuse of young people with learning disabilities. I think we're very, very mindful of the need to think about the added impact of disability. And I don't speak here as a person with disabilities. I speak here as a practitioner who wants us all to be part of changing practice. And disabled people face much higher risks of domestic abuse. The work of colleagues like Ravi Tiara in 2011 shone a real spotlight on the increased risks, twice the risks faced by those who are dependent on carers, often don't have a voice, and sometimes find themselves in situations where they haven't got access independently because of coercive control to getting help, to being heard, and to seeking help. So we carried out a piece of work with the funded by the Lloyds Bank Foundation, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about that. And if I could have the next slide, please. The work that we did was based on this knowledge that there is twice the risk for young people with disabilities. Spotlight reports from Safe Lives and Women's Aid have really highlighted groups who don't get enough attention in services. They highlighted the needs of Black and marginalised women. They highlighted the needs of deaf and disabled young women, and they highlighted the needs of LGBT young women. I want to really focus on the work we did, which was talking to young people themselves with learning disabilities and to practitioners. And what we found when we did our piece of work was that young disabled people were much less visible in services. Many domestic abuse services were working really, really hard to their limits sometimes, but didn't always have enough training in understanding the impact perhaps of a learning disability, the need for their services to reach out to disabled young people. We found also that social workers, often in adults, knew a lot more about the social care side, but didn't always think enough about domestic abuse. So what we needed was to try to bring those two worlds together. We're very conscious from looking at the policy agenda too, that policy does not always address the needs of disabled young people. The services that we spoke to often did their absolute best to reach out, but didn't necessarily reflect on whether they were reaching disabled young victims. Can I have the next slide, please? And one of the really key things that we found, particularly for young people with learning needs, was that often the impact of their learning disability on the way they saw the world was not understood, that maybe they were seen and described as challenging, and that particularly applied to those with autism and those with behaviours that people didn't always get to the bottom of. They blamed the behaviour rather than trying to understand what the behaviour of the young person was telling us. For many young people with learning needs, they face difficulty sustaining relationships and sometimes difficulties making sense of safe behaviours and healthy and safe relationships. For many of them, they haven't necessarily had the right help and support to understand those relationships. And although kids do relationship and sex education at school, it isn't always individually tailored to the needs of a young person with learning needs. They may have experienced, and 82% of young people with learning disabilities experience bullying. Many of them will have experienced racist bullying on top of that. And we're very, very aware that the Slade report in 2014 highlights real difficulties for Black young people getting access to diagnosis, that there is a later level of diagnosis, and that means families are not getting the right help early enough. Very aware too of the overlap between particularly autism and anxiety and the mental health needs of those young people. Some of the colleague organisations we spoke to, like Gallup, who have a lesbian and gay helpline for young people experiencing domestic abuse, they found that 55% of the callers had a mental health need or a disability. So the overlaps between different aspects of young people's lives that mean that they face increased barriers getting the right help are huge. And we know that when they experience intimate partner violence or domestic violence in their growing up life, that's often on the back of previous histories of undisclosed childhood abuse. So I can't echo enough that really powerful point Asmat made about understanding each woman's backstory. That information is crucial because that information may have affected her ability to reach out, her ability to know where services are, her self-confidence, and so many other aspects of her life. Can I have the next slide, please? The other key issue I think is really important for us to remind ourselves about as practitioners is that many young people with learning needs will not have had the right help to develop communication skills. Speech and language therapy is in really short supply. Advocacy is inconsistent and patchy across the country. Support needs of young people with learning disabilities are less likely to have been met, and they are far more likely to have been excluded from school. So they're not necessarily going to have had the usual helps and supports that teenagers have had growing up. And as Matt mentioned, for example, the number of moves she had in refuges, we know from all sorts of pieces of work that have been done that young people placed away from home often get moved frequently. And for those young people with learning needs who've also been looked after, we're very, very aware of the extent to which they're cut off from the positive attachment figures, as well as separated sometimes from those who are harming and hurting them. And in our research, when we talked to young workers from refuges, and particularly one I can remember telling me very, very clearly that young pregnant women and young women with babies often found that the social work help that they were getting was child protection intervention for the child, and it didn't look at therapy and trauma for this young woman who was trying so desperately to move away to safety and keep her child safe. And those points Asmat made about that are really powerful. We need to have much better collaboration between children's and adult services. We need to make sure that the women that we're working with, the survivors, they need to have help and support for their own recovery alongside the work we're doing to support their care of their child. And we need to try really hard to do a much better job of bridging those divides. These women need far more help and support for themselves in their own right. And isolation and not getting that help can mean that they're targeted again, and that sometimes their distress is never properly attended to. We must think more critically about these issues. Next slide, please. Lastly, if I've still got time, Rebecca, I can't see you waving at me just yet, but I'm very mindful of the time. We tried to work with young survivors to think about what sort of things would have helped, and to be treated like they mattered, to be heard. For a lot of young people with learning disabilities, they've grown up with people speaking over them, for them, about them. And for many, the first language may not be English. They may also need an interpreter. They may need a signer, but they have a right to have a voice. And if we don't promote that, then we're colluding with their silence, their invisibility. We've got to change this practice. We need also to understand the emotional barriers to asking for help and how scary that is. And the video at the start really highlighted that so clearly, with the young woman's explaining about that issue of control and that partner always being there. Dependence on a carer when you have a disability can often mean that that carer is present. We still need to see these young people on their own so that they have the space to talk safely. And as social workers, we've got to change the culture that's too shy to ask. It's really important that we talk to young people on their own. And we need to make sure that we don't just look at what young people tell us, but also at what they're doing. If they're moving away and trying to be safe, they're doing everything they can to protect, and we need to look at that behaviour and see the strength in it. We also need to help young people have the right of access to information about healthy relationships and choices, and the practice in learning to express those choices that they may never have had if they've had a very heterosexist, limited education in relationship safety. So we have a lot of work to do, but thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I've learned an enormous amount just listening to you over the last few minutes, and really would encourage everybody to dig deep into the guidance. The Ancraft Trust have really created an excellent section to help practitioners better understand the unique needs of disabled children and families. I think, again, the intersectional factors that stood out for me there were so many. You mentioned mental health, care experience, LGBT, systemic racism that holds children back from getting the diagnosis that they need at an earlier stage. So all really important to shine a light on. So enormous thanks, Sarah. We're now going to move over to Pragna, who is here from Southall Black Sisters. Thank you, Pragna.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a bit about the experiences of BME women, how they're impacted by gender-related abuse. I could spend all day. There are so many areas I could touch upon, but given I've only got 5 minutes, I'm going to kind of touch upon 2 areas that I think are really important, which is how to approach the role of religion and culture in shaping some, but particularly South Asian women's experiences of abuse. Because I think that sometimes what is seen as a culturally or religiously sensitive approach can actually be very, very problematic in terms of supporting vulnerable women and girls and children, in fact. And the second area is the specific problems faced by particularly migrant women due to the overlap of gender-related violence and immigration controls, and what that means in terms of women's ability to make disclosures and seek protection. Both of these barriers, both religion, culture, and immigration controls, present considerable barriers to BME women's rights to equality, justice, and freedom. So I don't want to say a lot about Southall Black Sisters, except that we've been organising now for 40 years. So for 40 years, we've provided holistic frontline advice, counselling, advocacy services, and combined it with campaigning to meet the needs of Black and minority women who represent some of the most marginalised and hard to reach women in society. And the bulk of our work using advocacy and campaigning is to assist women and children who are the overwhelming victims of domestic and other forms of gender-related violence obtain effective protection and assert their fundamental human rights. And as people have said, violence against women and children is by its nature hidden. And there's a range of cultural, social, structural factors that result in the non-identification or under-identification of many BME women's experiences of violence against women and girls. And the impact of the non-identification or under-identification is that the full scale and prevalence of violence against BME women and girls is unknown. Actually, official bodies still do not disaggregate data. So we don't know the scale of the problem. And a significant number of women and girls remain invisible to services as a result. But where data does exist, what it consistently indicates is that BME and migrant women are at disproportionate risk of some of the most severe forms of harm and are overrepresented in suicide and homicide statistics. And in fact, at the moment, as a result of the lockdown, police have carried out a review of homicides during the lockdown. And although only 8 months of data has emerged, it's shown overrepresentation of BME women. That research is not complete yet, but that's what the data so far is revealing. So in terms of barriers, first I want to talk about culture and religion and how the two are indistinguishable in reality and how they are used in women's daily experiences to justify violence, abuse, and restrictions on their freedoms. They're not only used to prevent exit from abuse, but to impose, as Azmat was talking about, and justify patriarchal control over women's bodies, their sexuality, their emotions, their decisions, and their actions, preventing them from expressing their own free will and enjoying fundamental human rights and freedoms, including the right to choice in marriage and sexuality. So for many, particularly South Asian, but other minority communities, concepts of honor and shame are critical. And they are actually embedded in religious and cultural dynamics, and they are the central organizing features of family life. And they are very difficult for women in particular to overcome, because the honor of the family community rests on women's behavior and conformity to community norms, and they are expected to maintain and preserve traditional family values according to those norms. And those norms really dictate, as Azmat so powerfully pointed out, how women dress, how they behave, who they marry, whether they leave a marriage, and so on and so forth. And any woman who doesn't conform attracts social stigma, which at one end of the spectrum is social harassment and ostracization, and a lack of permission to engage in community activities. And at the other end, the stigma can result in punishment, physical punishment, and even death in what are known as honor killings. But what's particularly important here to understand is how the paradigm of intimate partner violence is not appropriate on its own to analyze and address violence against women and girls in BME communities. That's because most BME women, particularly from certain South Asian backgrounds and minority backgrounds, will experience abuse from multiple perpetrators and within extended family and community structures. So there is a blurring of lines between family and community in the way that you might see more clear cut in the wider community. And that is precisely why great caution must be taken before involving family and community members and religious leaderships in the work of protecting women, whether they are used for interpretation, whether they're used to seek so-called expert advice on cultural understandings. One has to be very careful, because family and community members may be colluding in the harm, abuse directly, but also indirectly through the promotion of traditional family values. I'm always horrified at the way in which public bodies, including social services, in many instances, refer to local religious leaderships to understand and deal with violence against women and girls, without understanding that those leaderships are promoting those traditional values, so they become part of the problem and not the solution. And that's why I think social services and other public bodies involved in protection must really carry out due diligence in relation to who they involve in safeguarding plans, because many faith-based leaderships are far more interested in mediating women and children back into abusive families and encouraging them, rather than encouraging women to leave families altogether. So it's very important, and much caution needs to be exercised here. And it's very easy to become afraid of offending religious and cultural sensibilities, and as a result of that, not actually understand that protection is paramount, rather than offending religious and cultural sensibilities. The other significant problem, if I've got a few minutes, I want to highlight is the ways in which BME women's experiences of abuse are compounded by state responses that are also discriminatory or indifferent. And I'm particularly thinking here about the ways in which migrant women with insecure status find themselves in even more precarious positions as a result of their insecure immigration status. And that has actually recently been compounded by the government's hostile or compliant immigration policies, particularly the no recourse to public funds rule, which means that women cannot access any form of welfare support if they are subject to immigration control. These women particularly find themselves trapped in what are often heightened and prolonged forms of abuse. The no recourse condition is applied to those with subject to immigration control, and it actually is the key barrier that prevents migrant women's economic independence in the UK, and it prevents them from being able to disclose abuse, mainly because they can't. They're financially dependent on their abusers, and if they leave, they have no access to even refuges or safe accommodation because they can't pay the rent, and they cannot access housing benefit to pay the rent, and they cannot access other benefits to pay for their survival. So in effect, the state denies them the routes to safety that are available to other women in society. And what it means is that women are also too scared to report the abuse to statutory agencies because they are afraid that their partners or spouses will report them to immigration authorities, or the statutory agencies will report them to immigration authorities, which will lead to their deportation. And in any event, they're also afraid of becoming destitute. So the no recourse condition effectively enables perpetrators to evade justice altogether because women can't report them, and it creates a climate of impunity for perpetrators. And the situation has definitely worsened under the pandemic and the lockdown. And I have to say that here, the role of social services is key, because even when children are involved, we have seen so many times social services refusing to support vulnerable migrant women with children and no recourse to public funds. And some of the key problems that we encounter on a daily basis are: one, women are told that they don't have a duty to support them and that they would support the children, in other words, separate the mother from the children, which we have to challenge. Secondly, the children can stay with the abusers, so that we also sometimes challenge. Thirdly, that women should mediate themselves back into the abusive family, and the domestic violence isn't that serious. And fourthly, they will provide a ticket for the women and children to return to their countries of origin without conducting any kind of risk and needs assessment. These are some of the ways in which women are consistently, particularly migrant women with no recourse, consistently denied effective protection. And we really need to see a change, a real change in the way that public bodies deal with migrant women with no recourse to public funds. Of course, if you're a single woman and you've got no recourse to public funds, you don't stand a chance. And so there's a real gap in protection. There's a real problem in the way in which the law services that exist fail a whole cohort of women. So I'm going to stop here because I think my 5 minutes are up, just to say that, you know, we've seen the tragic death of Sarah Everhard, and we need to take account of the fact that despite 4 decades of campaigning around violence against women and girls, not enough is being done to tackle the kind of underlying causes and consequences, which is gender inequality. We're not seeing enough being done, enough resources being put into the need to deal with gender inequality at its heart, at all levels, in all spheres, education, law, services, in all spheres. And not enough is being done to ensure that the barriers that are created by the intersection of race, gender, class, disability are addressed so that all women are protected. And the domestic abuse bill at the moment, there are some good things in it, but there are an awful lot of things, you know, that ought to be in it, including resources to ensure that the most vulnerable are protected. And so we've still got a long way to go in all areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pragna. You started this by saying I could speak about this all day, and from the bottom of my heart, I could listen to you all day. I really, really wish that what you've shared was mandatory for every single social worker in the land, and we'll do our best at BASWA to disseminate and circulate all that incredibly, incredibly useful knowledge. So again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. Unfortunately, because of time, we're going to have to move on a lot more swiftly than I'd have liked, to Sarah, who's going to speak about the Safer and Together model. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Becca. So my background is in children and families social work and also in domestic abuse. I worked in a specialist recovery project for women and girls. And I recently became a trainer in the Safe and Together model. And I'm going to describe it very briefly to you today, but I hope you'll find that a lot of what I say resonates with what we've heard already today about the experiences of people with lived experience of domestic abuse and some of the tips that they have for social workers. So can I have my first slide, please? To summarise the Safe and Together model in one snappy sentence, it's a perpetrator pattern-based, survivor strength-focused, child-centred approach. And it can be applied to coercive control situations in any relationship, but it does acknowledge, of course, that in the majority of reported cases, women are the victims and men are the perpetrators. So essentially, the model tries to change the lens that we view domestic abuse through and gives us tools and frameworks to help us move away from the failure to protect approach to one where perpetrators are held fully to account for child safety and the protective efforts that survivors have made are recognised. The full training on the model takes the equivalent of 4 days, and an overview usually takes an hour. So this is going to be a really basic introduction with some links at the end where you can read some more. So the Safe and Together Institute is based in the United States. The model was developed by a man called David Mandel, and their mission, as it states on this slide, is to create, nurture and sustain a global network of domestic violence-informed child welfare professionals, communities and systems. And this model has been adopted in several areas in Scotland, and it's gaining interest in other parts of the UK, as well as Australia and Asia. Could we have the next slide, please? So the model creates better outcomes for families and systems through practical training with tools that are proven to impact key areas of practice. And the 4 key areas of practice that the model focuses on are interviewing, assessments, documentation and case planning. And for each of these areas, there are tools that we can use to work with survivors, with children and with perpetrators. Next slide, please. So in the same way that we need to talk about services being trauma-informed and culturally competent, I don't believe we can provide our best service to children and families without also being domestic abuse informed. And what you see here is an abbreviated version of a tool which we use in training. And it's designed to help us reflect, both as individuals and organisations, on where we sit on the journey from domestic abuse destructive to domestic abuse proficient practice and policy. So domestic abuse destructive practice would include the failure to protect approach, when our main focus is on the behaviour of the survivor and looking into her as the person responsible for ensuring the safety of the children, which is basically describing what we heard earlier. Often the survivor gets the message from services that she risks having her children removed from her care if she can't provide safety for them. And by focusing on what she's not doing, she's not leaving the relationship, she's not moving out, rather than on identifying her strengths, then we overlook the strategies that she is using to help keep her children safe. And we also remove responsibility from the perpetrator as a parent, and he almost becomes invisible. And this affects our ability to get to the goal of improving child safety. So one of the things the model asks us to consider is that the perpetrator is as responsible as the survivor for the children's safety and well-being, and it's his pattern of behaviour that's placing them at risk, so he should be held fully accountable for this as a parent. So when systems become domestic violence proficient, they see the key issue as being one caused by the perpetrator's pattern, not by anything the survivor has done or hasn't done to keep our children safe. And this gets reflected in the language we use, how we document, and how we plan for interventions. So the continuum is a really useful tool for talking about systems change. And in training, participants are asked to think about where they are now and what they can do to move up towards being domestic violence proficient. And you can see a copy of the continuum in the handout section that you can download. Next slide, please. So there are 3 key principles that underlie the model. And the ultimate goal is to keep children safe and together with the non-abusive parent. And when we do a really good assessment, it often becomes an easier choice to justify doing this because we've got a much better idea of what she's doing to promote child safety. Partnership with the non-offending parent is our most effective tool for getting accurate information about the perpetrator's behaviour. She knows more than anyone else about his behaviour and what her children need to be safe, and successfully partnering with her means that we recognise and understand everything that she's done to keep them safe in spite of the abuse being perpetrated against her. And this involves recognising actions that we might assume that she should be doing anyway as a mother, for example, making sure the children are fed and clothed and they get to school. But have we recognised how much effort it takes to do that in the context of coercive control? And intervening with perpetrators is necessary to reduce the risk of harm to children. It requires setting change goals, which in turn requires a knowledge of his pattern of behaviour. If we don't have that, then we're not really going to partner effectively and ensure the safety of the children. The model doesn't focus on single incidents of abuse, it looks at a pattern and how that pattern impacts the child and the family. And we can use the child-focused elements of the first principle, safety, healing from trauma, stability and nurturance, as anchors. So if we're talking to perpetrators, we can ask them, what have they done to harm these things, and what role are they going to do in what role are they going to play in promoting recovery? For example, if the children are referred to therapy, is he supportive, is he neutral, or is he actually sabotaging of that? And that's working in that way can really help to hold them to account for the impact of their behaviour on the children. Next slide, please. I'm just going to show this next slide really briefly. It's a useful visual it shows how the model helps us to focus on the perpetrator's pattern, not on the relationship or the survivor's behaviour as the source of concern. And it helps us to connect the dots between his behaviour and other child-related issues. We often hear that children weren't present during an incident, so they weren't affected. However, we know that children are affected beyond seeing or hearing. We need to look at how is his pattern of behaviour impacted on, for example, the housing situation, employment, income, or on how the survivor is able to focus on the children's needs. For example, have they had to move as an impact of the abuse? If so, what's the effect of that been? Did it affect the survivors' opportunities for employment or to access support? So instead of just exploring what children saw, we can explore things like, how did your arrest affect the overall functioning of your family? Did it make the family stronger or weaker? What impact did it have on your children? And really help him to pick it apart and recognise the impact that goes far beyond what children see or hear. Next slide, please.
Sarah, I am. Oh, sorry. No, I just said, just as a quick warning, amazing. If we could maybe wrap up in 30 seconds so we have a Q&A section, that would be amazing. Thank you.
The model really takes account of intersectionalities, which is relevant to everything we've discussed today. That runs through the whole model. And the last slide, if any of this has whet your appetite and you want to find out more, there are some links there to find out more about the model, and also the link to book training, which is available UK-wide, and our next intake is in May. So have a look at some of that information, and I'm happy to answer any questions if people want to get in touch.
Thank you enormously, Sarah. Hopefully lots of people will take up that offer. In the very short time we've got left, I'd love to hear questions focused on all these intersectionalities of all the wisdom and experience that's here today. One of them is, does Pragna have any practical tips as to how to get a foot in the door in communities where it's closed?
That's a good question, and I think it can be very, very difficult. I think that what has to happen is we've got to encourage more work with women in communities. I think one of the things that's been going on for too long is that people think that to get a foot in the door of BME communities, you need to work with the obvious community institutions, which are often religious. And that's not going to enable access to women. So I think that we need to find other ways of accessing women. I think entry points in relation to work with health, the health sector, with the education sector, where women drop children off, being able to publicize services in, you know, those kinds of places is going to be quite critical. I think the key tip for me is that you've got to stop seeing women as the subjects of their community leaderships and as citizens. And if you understand women as citizens, then publicity has to be aimed at women in the same way that in the wider society, you don't go through a church to reach women. You actually reach women by publicizing services and making campaigning around, you know, zero tolerance around violence against women and girls, for example. Those are very effective campaigns that reached women. You didn't go through mediators. I think in the same way, I think it's really important that we start addressing women as an audience in minority communities rather than expecting them to be represented by others who may or may not really have their interests at heart.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pragna. So helpful. We've got another question, which is, once identifying someone who is living in the circumstances that Asmat describes, it can be really difficult to plan the best way to make contact without raising risks through alerting other family members. So what would Asmat suggest as the best way to approach this situation to ensure support's provided whilst mitigating against other risks?
I think it's about, it goes down to trust. You've really got to build that trust with that individual, and to get an understanding of the background and what's happened, in order to support them, because trust is so important. I know that I never had a social worker, and I was never offered any kind of support whilst living in a refuge, whilst living in any of the refuges I lived in. Whilst the staff there were absolutely amazing, and I couldn't fault them at all, everything I did was by myself. I'd grown up in a very small town. I wasn't allowed to go to the shops on my own. So, you know, I had to learn all of those life skills whilst being in the refuges. I had to learn what a bank was. I had to learn to go to the shops. You know, so it's about trust. It really does boil down to trust and getting that support from others.
Thank you so much, Asmat. Again, enormously powerful words. Sarah, we've got one question for yourself, which is, if you could give one piece of advice that social workers could almost memorise from today and carry with them when working with disabled survivors, what would that be? Oh, sorry, I think you might be on mute.
Sorry, thank you. It slightly echoes what my colleagues have just said, actually. Find out about the young person's preferred style of communication, find out what messages they've been given about themselves, and find out their preferred way of communicating, and allow much more time. Building up the trust and the relationship, as both Pragna and Asmat just said, is the absolute foundation. But with disabled young people, it can often take longer. You've got to be prepared to put more time in to find out and do some planning, get to know them, but find out how they communicate and where they're comfy. If they've got sensory needs, if they've got, if they find noise, light, spaces, big groups difficult, find where they're most comfy and listen, give them as much control as possible. Listen to how they prefer to be so that you can create that space. I guess that applies to everybody, actually, doesn't it? We all need that, but really valuing how somebody will feel safe. Where's a safe space for them? And I think the other key message that I really pick up from my colleagues is, don't use family members as an interpreter. We don't want to reinforce those dynamics of control. And Black and minoritized women have the same rights to equal protection. Disabled young people have the same rights to equal protection, but they face a lot more barriers. So our practice is what needs to change.
Thank you, Sarah. And picking up on what you've said about the importance of communication and interpreters, I just want to flag that within the guide, we've also consulted with Sign Health, and we have a whole section on working with people who are deaf or have hearing impairments. So enormously helpful. Oh, sorry, go on, Sarah.
Becca, can I just add to that? Sign Health and Brooke have got some really good films and resources. And I'd really urge practitioners to look at the Brooke traffic light and all the various resources they've got for young people with learning needs. They had a special focus on that in 2019. And Sign Health have got lots of films that are really useful with signed and signed over material that is critical. Really good. Sorry.
Excellent. No, thank you so much. We've got a very short time. If you need support after this, please do approach BASWA England. We have our professional support service for social workers. If you want to debrief, we're here for you. If you want to join our family, child and family group and campaign on these issues, again, we'd love to hear from you. Very, I can't say just how grateful from the bottom of my heart I am for everyone here today, panelists, survivors. Please do go to the guidance for any more questions that you will have, and thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.